Okay. Thank you all very much for coming out. I realized actually today, not that I followed this too closely myself, but I realized I was competing with the Olympics. So it's great to see so many people out here interested in the history of religion in Upper Canada as opposed to who's winning that gold medal. But of course you can read about that tomorrow. So I brought a couple of maps, which I'm going to, now unfortunately I don't have enough for everybody, so if you want to just take a look and pass them along, I only have 12. They're in color. They were done around the time of the War of 1812. I don't need them back, so there are 12 people who would like these maps at the end. They're actually quite nice. Just feel free to take them. I always find it's helpful to take a look at a map because then you get a sense of how the province was settled early on and how religion spread along with settlement. So quickly then, just first a word about Methodism and its origins, in case you're not familiar with that. Methodism began as a renewal movement inside the Church of England, which is a great irony when you look at Upper Canadian history, because the Church of England and the Methodists were very much in competition with one another. The Methodism was started in the 1740s in Britain by Church of England clergyman by the name of John Wesley. Very interesting guy. He did a missionary stint in Savannah, Georgia in the 1730s. It went very badly for him. He came back to England with his tail tucked between his legs, and he started this very successful religious renewal movement inside the Church of England. And he took up something that he learned from a friend of his by the name of George Whitefield, field preaching. So he'd go out into a field and he'd just start preaching. And he would preach to people that the Church of England was less interested in. He was interested in preaching to the poor. And the poor didn't necessarily want to go to church. So he would preach in the field, and he would preach to very large numbers of people. And so he remained within the Church of England. John Wesley was always a Church of England clergyman, so there was a great deal of conflict between himself and some of the more conservative branches of the Church of England. Methodism eventually spread over to North America, and Wesley sent official preachers over in the 1760s, and then the Revolutionary War broke out, and Methodism found itself in a very awkward spot, because when the Revolutionary War was being waged, one of the last things you wanted to be identified with was the established Church of England. So Wesley realized this, and he reluctantly allowed the Americans to form their own separate Methodist church. That happened in 1784. And that did not happen in Britain, though. In Britain, till after Wesley's death, he died in 1791, a very old man, attributed his long life to eating frugally, only drinking water, and working very, very hard, which he did. And but in America, the Methodists started out in 1784, and they had some advantages over their competition. The largest competitor for souls in the New Republic, in the United States, was the Congregational Church. And that was the established church in New England. But of course, after the Revolutionary War, there was the separation of church and state. And that meant that churches no longer could rely on the government to pay the salaries of ministers. Being a minister then was no longer an office, no longer a position in the government. It became more of a profession. And so the Congregationalists, after the Revolutionary War, found themselves sort of demoted. Whereas the Methodist preachers found themselves in a way promoted, because now suddenly the Methodist preachers could actually celebrate the sacraments with people. Wesley authorized them to do this before the Revolutionary War, Wesley told all his followers in America, if you need to go to church on Sundays, you need to go to the Church of England. If you want communion, you go to the Church of England. If you want to get married, you go to the Church of England. If you want to get baptized, you go to the Church of England. After 1784, no more of that. Suddenly, Methodist preachers could do all of those things. Wesley authorized them to do this. He ordained them to do this by sending over someone that he himself had ordained to ordain them. Well, of course, up here in Upper Canada, in this part of the world, things are starting to get. People were starting to arrive here. United Empire Loyalists were starting to arrive in 1783, and some of them were lay Methodists, but no actual ordained Methodist preachers came here until 1790. And that coincided with a period that historians call the Second Great Awakening. That was a time of big revivals. There was a First Great Awakening that happened mostly in what subsequently became the United States, beginning in about 1740s. And it lasted to about 1760 or so, and then religion started to go actually on a decline. But around 1790, suddenly religion was on the upswing. And the Methodists in particular were experiencing a great deal of success around the time that the first preacher crossed over the St. Lawrence into this region. Why did that happen? Historians have asked themselves, why is this sudden uptick in the interest in religion? And in particular, the interest in Methodism? Well, the Methodists had some advantages over their competition, particularly the more established churches, what are sometimes called the formalist churches, the Congregationalists, the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians. All of these groups liked to worship in a church. The Methodists didn't care about that. They would jump on the back of a horse and they would head out into the wilderness. And they would preach to whoever would listen to them. And they would find small communities, a few log cabins, and they would go around and knock on doors and say, I'm going to be preaching in a couple of hours. You better come out and listen to me if you want to save your soul. And so people would come out for lots of reasons, one of which is they're probably bored. There's not much to do when you're just, living in the backwoods. I mean, there's lots to do, but it gets boring. And so something's going on. You come out to hear it. And so the Methodist preacher would call this an appointment. And he would say, I'm going to come back. And so then he'd ride his horse into the wilderness. No roads. Maybe some markings on trees to guide him, maybe not. And he would form what they called a preaching circuit. And so it would take him about usually 2 weeks to 4 weeks to travel the circuit. Ideally, every day, he would preach at least once. And he didn't have a home. He did not have a wife. Even though they could get married, there was no theological rule against it. The leader of Methodism in America, a man by the name of Francis Asbury, frowned on that very much for two reasons. One, if you had a wife, you weren't going to be as committed. And number two, if you had a wife, you were going to cost the church more. Your salary doubled if you had a wife. Okay? And Methodist preachers were not paid much. They were paid about 1/8 of what a Congregationalist minister would make. And unlike a Congregationalist minister, they had to preach every single day. So that was one of the advantages the Methodists had. It was a structural one. They didn't need churches. People were spreading out in the New Republic. They were trying to establish themselves on the land. And the communities were very small, much too small to support an expensive clergyman with a church and a rectory, but not too small to have a Methodist preacher show up every couple of weeks and give a sermon. So that worked very well. It was cheap. The Methodists could travel fast, and they could travel light, and they could always get there before the competition. Yeah, they could always get there first. And so once you got there first, then you had a community. One of the other advantages they had was, even though Methodism itself was pretty hierarchical, they had opportunities for anybody to become a leader within the movement. So the Methodist preacher would come into this tiny community with a few log cabins, and he's not going to get there again for 2 to 4 weeks. Well, what's going to happen in the meantime? He would set up a class, and the class would have a leader, and the class would meet regularly, at least once a week, and the class would study the scriptures. They would be accountable to one another for their spiritual development. They would study other books. Another thing Methodist preachers did was they sold books. Methodists in America established their own, they were the first denomination in America to establish their own denominational publishing house in Philadelphia in 1789. So the Methodists would travel around. That's why they were called Saddlebag Preachers, because they had saddlebags full of books. And they would sell those. They would refer to them in their sermons. And then they would say, by the way, I got 5 copies of this book here. And that's partly how they underwrote their salaries. But also it was a way of spreading literacy and also deepening piety. And then there were other strategies they had for reinforcing your denominational identity. By owning these books that were published by the Methodist Church, you were identifying yourself as a good Methodist. Because the profits from the sale of the books paid the ministers and also paid for other missionary activities. So if you bought those books, then you were also helping the church in a sort of a wider area fulfill its mission. So they had classes. Now, interesting thing about these classes, the classes could be led by women, not just men. In the States, too, there were even records of enslaved people leading those classes. Isn't that astonishing? Imagine a slave leading a class of free people. It happened. Now, the Methodists were always deeply opposed to slavery. When John Wesley went to Savannah in the 1730s, he saw slavery, American slavery, firsthand. And he was appalled at the cruelty of it. And he was opposed to it his entire life. So the Methodists were a force against that. And so this is one way that they could oppose it, by putting slaves in positions of authority in classes. It's quite astonishing. Another role that they had for people was exhorters. So exhorters were people who would speak in public about their own faith, and exhorters were licensed, and they could be men, or they could be women too. This was not okay in other established formalist churches. So the Methodists had this opportunity for people to take positions of leadership and authority when the traveling preacher wasn't there. And then eventually, too, they also developed local preachers. Local preachers were licensed. They could preach. They could do more than exhort. The difference between preaching and exhorting was preaching meant you took a passage of Scripture and preached a sermon on it. Exhorting, you weren't allowed to take a passage of Scripture. You just had to talk about your faith. But they used to have this thing where people they would call steal a passage. So if a woman was giving a sermon, it would have to be called an exhortation. She couldn't tell you where the passage was she was preaching on, but she could refer to it. So there were ways around these rules. Now, another advantage that the Methodists had in America, the Congregationalists and most of the Presbyterians were Calvinists. Calvinism is a doctrine that teaches not everyone can be saved. Some people are destined to be saved, and others are destined not to be saved. And there's nothing you can do about it. You can't get from one group to the other. You're either going to be saved or you're not. And so this was Calvin's belief in the elect. Now when you think about it in political terms, it's a spiritual aristocracy, right? Some people are better than others. Not just more intelligent, not just wealthier, not just more politically empowered, but spiritually better in the eyes of God. The Methodists did not believe that. John Wesley did not believe that. He subscribed to a theology called Arminianism. And Arminianism taught that Christ died for all, not just some, not just for the elect. Wesley also believed in a Calvinistic doctrine called total human depravity, and because we're also totally depraved, we cannot respond to God's love. But Wesley got around that by saying, yes, that's true, but God gives us the grace to respond to Him, and he called that prevenient grace. So He gives that to everybody. So that meant salvation is open to all. Spiritual egalitarianism. Now in the New Republic, there was political egalitarianism. So you had these mutually reinforcing ideologies. You had the religious ones saying we're all equal, and then you had people like Thomas Jefferson saying politically we're all equal. So these become mutually reinforcing, works really well down in the United States. But what about what's going on in Upper Canada? Just going to keep my eye on the time here. In Upper Canada, you do not have a republic. It's a different situation. You have an established church in Upper Canada. It is the Church of England. The Constitutional Act of 1791 sets aside 1/7 of all lands for the maintenance of a Protestant clergy, i.e. the Church of England, possibly the Church of Scotland, the established church in Scotland. So 2 established churches in Britain, the Church of England, the Church of Scotland. Those ministers, those churches, those congregations will be entitled to government support. Nobody else will. Nobody else will. The separation of church and state, that's an American thing. Okay? It's not a Canadian thing, at least not with the Constitutional Act of 1791. So the Methodists come over the border, and they're bringing with them a spiritual ideology that doesn't naturally cohere with the political ideology in Upper Canada. So that's something that is an obstacle to the spread of Methodism here. But they have all those other structural advantages still over the Church of England. Their ministers are on horseback, they're establishing classes, they're making use of local talent, right, bringing people up through the ranks. And something else that they're doing because of that structure, you don't have to go to seminary if you want to be a Methodist preacher. You don't have to go to school. You just get the call. God calls you, and then you become an exhorter, then you become then you start traveling around with an established preacher. You're taken on trial. And while you're on trial and you're traveling around, you're getting to do a little bit of preaching, you're watching how the established preacher is conducting himself, how this is all organized, and within a couple of years, 2 to 4 years, you're ordained. No schooling required. However, you are expected to read a lot of books, okay, which is something that is often obscured when you look in histories. The emphasis is on Methodist preachers as not being very well educated. But in fact, they were actually quite self-taught. So they would read on the backs of their horses, because they were traveling all the time. And that was something Wesley used to do. He would read, and he'd just drop the reins down, and he would read. And he would also write. Wesley published a lot of books. He didn't want his preachers doing that, though. They weren't allowed to publish books, but they were forced to read. That was a requirement of being a Methodist preacher. So you had your books there, your saddlebag, you're selling them, but you're also reading them yourself. Now, 1791. You know, it's very easy, when we're looking back at history, to look at the way things turned out and say, oh, well, they had to turn out that way. But they didn't have to turn out that way. The democratic experiment, called the United States of America, could have failed. And most people who came to Upper Canada were pretty sure that it was going to. The first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, John Graves Simcoe, very strong churchman, he was pretty darn sure that those Americans were pretty silly in about 10 to 20 years. The whole thing was going to come crashing down. And once it did, then they would all realize, oh, Upper Canada, that's the way it needs to be. So John Graves Simcoe comes over here as the Lieutenant Governor. They set up a Westminster style of government over here. So you have a small elected assembly. You have an appointed legislative council, which is like the House of Lords. The Assembly is like the House of Commons. And the Lieutenant Governor is the place of the king. And they're all there in Niagara. Okay, that's one of the first settlements. Niagara, in Kingston, And there's really not much here in Toronto at all. In fact, one of the earliest preachers who came here, Nathan Bangs, I'm going to distribute some of his material presently. When he came to Toronto, he said it was a small collection of log cabins inhabited by very wicked people. He was not impressed. That was in 1801. But the first Methodist preacher comes over. His name is William Lossey. He crosses the frozen St. Lawrence on his horse in 1790. He was officially appointed here by the Americans in 1791. He was an American. So he started gathering. Now, one of the things that some people sometimes say to me, "Why did you study the Methodists? Are you a Methodist?" No, I'm not a Methodist. And then sometimes I'm also asked, "Are you a minister?" No, I'm not a minister. So why did you study the Methodists? Because the Methodists kept good records. So it's possible to study them. Like, they wrote a lot of stuff down. They kept journals, they kept diaries, they kept excellent minutes. It was interesting to hear you go through the whole thing with your minutes. Maybe one day some historian's going to be studying those minutes to see how these groups actually work. So they kept great minutes. They kept good accounts too. They were very, very focused on numbers, growth. They wanted to make sure that every year they had more Methodists than the year before. So they kept very close track of who was a Methodist and who wasn't a Methodist. And so William Lossey came over, he started preaching. Within a year, he had about 150 Methodists. Not bad. He was preaching just outside of Kingston. Now, of course, he also fell in love when he was here. He had a withered arm, sort of an unusual character, fell in love with a young woman, and then he went back to the States and he said, "Oh, this is great, you have to send more preachers to Upper Canada." Of course, he didn't tell Francis Asbury about falling in love because Asbury wouldn't have liked that very much. But he figured, I'll come back and, we'll just get that sorted out. So they sent another preacher up here by the name of Darius Dunham. He came and started preaching around Kingston as well. And Dunham stole Lossey's girlfriend. Unfortunately, that drove Lossey sort of mad, and he left the ministry. And he died in obscurity down in the States. But it's interesting because they put his bones back up here, and if you go to Bay of Quinte area, there's a church there called the Hay Bay Church. It's one of the first Methodist, in fact, the first Methodist church built, and I'm going to be talking about an event that took place there, the first camp meeting in Upper Canada. And so you can see his grave there. It's kind of interesting because it didn't actually go that smoothly. It's sort of like if you go to Savannah, Georgia, we were down there a couple of years ago, they have all these statues down there to John Wesley. Like he was some great hero in Savannah, when in fact he was run out of town on a rail. For a similar reason, because he fell in love with a young woman who wasn't in love with him, and when she went off and married somebody else, he decided that she wasn't living the Christian life anymore, so she wasn't allowed to go to communion. And the townsfolk didn't like that, so they pretty much ran him out. But still, there's all these statues down there. It's interesting how history can get used like that. Anyway, so Lossey's bones are there. Darius Dunham, he's an interesting guy. He figures into actually an account that I'm going to distribute. He was famous for exorcising demons in the backwoods of Upper Canada. And there's some very interesting passages. One of the books I brought along is the first volume of a 5-volume series published in the 1860s called Case and His Contemporaries. One of the earliest preachers, Methodist preachers, to operate in Upper Canada was a man by the name of William Case. And he had a very long and distinguished career as a preacher. He was born in America, like many of the earliest Methodist preachers. And a fellow by the name of John Carroll, who was also a Methodist preacher, put together this anecdotal history of Methodism. It's fascinating reading. It's also, he went around and interviewed people before they died and said, what happened here, what happened there? And there's all sorts of amazing stories in here about things like exorcisms and camp meetings and so on. So if you want to take a look at this, I'll have it up at the front. So anyway, where was I? So the Methodists come up here and they're causing problems for the Church of England. Now the Church of England at this point only has three ministers. Imagine, in the whole province. They've got 2 stationed around Kingston, and they've got 1 in Niagara. That's it. Okay? The Methodists, they're going to have no problem out-competing the Church of England when it comes to putting men in the field. because their guys don't have to go to seminary. A lot cheaper to put guys in the field when you don't have to send them to school. So there's 2 preachers, and then within a few years there's 5, and then there's 6, and then there's 8. There's still only 3 clergymen. Now they have some powers that the Methodist ministers don't have. One of the things the clergymen can do is marry people. Methodist ministers can't do that. And in fact, they don't get to do that till way, way later. Much later, into the 1830s anyway, maybe even later than that. So it was a long struggle for religious equality in the province. But one of the things that the Methodists started doing, and I'm going to distribute these. I don't quite have enough for everybody, but I almost do. So I certainly have enough. If you happen to have come in a group of 2, maybe you could just share. This is another tactic that the Methodists had. They would hold something they called a camp meeting revival. And the Church of England clergymen deplored this type of thing. Camp meeting revival was a revival. Now I know that when I go to church with my wife, if the preacher or the minister or the priest, because we go all over the place, talks for more than 10 minutes, that is too long. And if the whole service is more than an hour, that is too long. And then probably a lot of you feel like that. If it's more than an hour, it's too long. The camp meetings would go on for 3 to 5 days. Day and night. Day and night. And they would have sermon after sermon, then they would have singing, then they would have healings, then they would have exorcisms. These were big events that happened in the Canadian backwoods. Now the first one of these in Upper Canada was held in the Hay Bay area by a fellow by the name of, a bunch of Methodist preachers were there. There was William Case, there was Darius Dunham, and there was a guy by the name of Nathan Banks, who is extremely important in the history of religion in this province. He was also an American. He was born in New England, and he came to Canada in 1799. Now, around this time, a lot of Americans were coming up to the province because it was easier to get land here and not get ripped off than it was in the States. And so these people were sometimes called late loyalists, but these people were not loyalists. They were interested in land, right? Now they weren't necessarily wild democratic American patriots either, but they were not coming here as political refugees like the UELs. They were coming here because of the economic opportunities. One of these guys was Nathan Banks, crossed over into Niagara in 1799. Now that was one of the places where there was a Church of England clergyman. His name was Robert Addison, and you can actually see his church. Now, if you go to Niagara-on-the-Lake, there is a lovely old Anglican church there, and they have all this interesting material in there about Robert Addison, early, courageous Church of England missionary. But that was not Nathan Banks' impression of Robert Addison, which is again another sort of interesting sidelight on history. Nathan Banks became a very prominent American Methodist, and he was the first official authorized historian of Methodism in America. He wrote a 4-volume history of Methodism in America, and I brought the first volume. This was published in 1840, and so there's 3 more. And in here, he describes some of his own experiences coming across the border in 1799. Now, when he came here, he was not a Methodist, but he was very, very interested in religion. And so he went to Robert Addison's church on Sunday, and he was not impressed with Robert Addison. Robert Addison, he said, gave a rapid and vapid sermon, which he read from a sheet of paper. He didn't give it, just extemporizing. He had to read it. And also, unbelievably, Robert Addison played cards. You can imagine, he played cards terrible for minister to do. And not only that, but he also danced Terrible. Nathan Banks just thought this was horrendous. So he never went back to Robert Addison's church. And pretty soon, in his little community there, where he was working as a tutor, sure enough, in comes on a horse one day, a Methodist circuit rider. Starts preaching. Bangs falls under the spell of this Methodist preacher, and he becomes what Methodists at the time called a mourner. Now, when you heard the gospel preached, you didn't suddenly get converted like that. You got convicted of your sins first. And that meant you became aware of what a great sinner you were in the eyes of God. And that God did not forgive you. You were an unforgiven sinner, repentant but unforgiven. And you could stay in a state like that for months. And some of these journals that you'll read, I mean, it's extraordinary the amount of psychological stress that these people went through, feeling like they were going to go to hell. And they knew it. And so they would have benches at the front when the Methodist preacher was preaching. They're called mourners' benches. You would go there and mourn your own sins. Eventually, one day, you would feel it. You wouldn't know it, you would feel it. God would forgive you of your sins. You would feel it. It was a sensation. One of the things Wesley insisted on was that religion was not up here. It was down here. It was in the heart. You knew in your heart when your sins were forgiven. And so this was something that Nathan Bangs was waiting for. And then suddenly one day he realized, yes, my sins are forgiven. And he became a Methodist preacher. He started following one of these preachers around, and eventually he was accepted on trial, and then he was ordained. And then in 1805, he organized, or helped to organize, Upper Canada's first camp meeting. Now, I've got a passage here from Sunday. I apologize for how small the type is. The whole thing is available in an edition that I put together on the web of these journals for one of the requirements of my PhD. So on the right-hand side is Bangs' journal itself. And I put that there just because it's sometimes interesting to see, and also it's quite tricky to read that. And so it took me a long time to get used to his handwriting, enough that I could actually read it. But this is a description of events in the Hay Bay area in 1805. And so this is what happened on Sunday. It started at 7 in the morning. And if you look, it went all the way through the whole day, through the whole night, and until 10 o'clock the next morning. That's how long the service went. And some of what goes on here is very interesting. And I just want to read a couple of passages to you and get your impressions of this. So the people flocked together from I'm on the second paragraph. From different quarters until we judged. These were at least 2,000. Some suppose there were 2,500. Now that is a massive number of people for that time. And so you might be wondering, how can that be? And you have to remember, the Methodists were spread all over the province. Okay? Not like the Church of England, which tended to concentrate on the towns, the urban areas. The Methodists were very interested in the backwoods. And so they had local preachers there, they had exhorters, they had traveling preachers. They got the word out that this was happening. And so people would travel for days and days and days to get there for this event. This was a big deal. There would be a lot of preachers there, and this was a time for receiving a special blessing. So as the prayers of the faithful were so loud and insistent around the stage, they would set up a stage in the woods, and people would set up tents, and they would stay there. That preaching could not be heard. We withdrew to a wagon where N.B. Nathan Banks spoke on Yea Doubtless, and I count all these things but loss for the excellency of the knowledge of Jesus Christ my Lord, i.e., I'm preaching a sermon. This is my text. After this, the noise ceased, so that the congregated assembly gathered around the stand, from whence Brother Ryan, Henry Ryan, another early Methodist preacher who actually ended up causing the church a lot of grief later on. He was a former stage boxer, actually. He was a big guy. And when people at these camp meetings would get rowdy, he would physically throw them out. He would grab them, and they would sometimes build enclosures, and he would throw them right over the fence. So, yeah. All right, there was another story of...
He should be at the Olympics.
Yeah, of Henry Ryan. There was one occasion during the winter. Now imagine this: you're riding a horse, you're looking for a log cabin, hopefully to stay in. It's winter time. If you don't find one, you could die. And so Henry Ryan showed up at one of these log cabins. It's the only one around. It's getting dark. It's freezing cold. He knocks on the door. Door opens. Guy says, "You're not a Methodist preacher, I hope." Henry Ryan says, "Yeah," and he goes, "Get out of here, I hate you guys." And Henry Ryan says, "Well, I need a place to stay." And he says, "Well, you're not staying here." And Ryan says, "Well, we'll see, that depends on who of us is stronger." Yeah. And it turned out Henry Ryan was stronger, so the guy didn't have any choice. So Brother Ryan spoke, "Many are called, but few are chosen." But even while he was speaking, the cries of the distressed in some of the neighboring tents was such that it occasioned much disorder and irregularity, as some would be running to and fro and from place to place to see what was doing, for I suppose they saw strange things today. There was not, however, such a terrible outcry now as yesterday, yet the Lord was still at work. Some exhortations followed the sermon, so remember the distinction there. And so that means lay people were doing this. Women were probably doing this. And then preparation was made for administering the supper of the Lord. The disciples of Jesus came forward with boldness and owned their divine teacher in the holy ordinance, whilst hundreds of spectators were looking on with amazement to see the mighty display of God's power. For many were overwhelmed with the loving presence of God during this season of commemorating one of the greatest events ever exhibited to human view. After the sacrament, the meeting was carried on with exhortation, prayer, and singing, shouting, and praising without any intermission till next morning. We shall notice something remarkable during this period. Just after the sacrament, a young woman of high rank, remember Methodists were not of high rank, they were of middling to low rank, of high rank was struck by the power of God, and her sister, seeing her weeping, came and took her away by force from the multitude. Some of the daughters of Jerusalem, seeing the daughters of pride running away with one of Christ's lambs, pursued after them, retook the broken-hearted sinner and brought her back. The wolf who stole away the lamb followed back and was soon shot with an arrow from the Almighty, which constrained her to roar aloud for mercy, and it was not long before God heard her cry and changed her ferocious nature into the lamb-like nature of Christ. Anon, the retaken captive was enabled to say, "The Lord has become my salvation, therefore I will praise him." A little boy of 11 years old, Kent, was struck under conviction in the camp and converted on the spot. I saw them carry him away to a tent whilst his tongue was employed in lifting forth the praises of his Redeemer. A young man who had received the spirit of adoption not long since had got into despair. Now, Methodists did not believe in guaranteed salvation. You could lose it. And this young man thought he had it and he lost it, and he was in despair. By giving away to the suggestion of Satan that he had since sinned against the Holy Ghost, i.e. the unforgivable sin. His distress was so great that he was delirious. He was brought into the camp so much against his will that we were obliged to hold him in order to help him there. His case was opened to us by Brother Darius Dunham, remember him, guy who steals girlfriends and also casts out demons. And his actions plainly indicated that he was possessed. For as soon as prayer was mentioned, he would struggle with all his might to get away, which seemed to be similar to that recorded by the evangelist. "Let us alone, trouble us not before the time." The wicked children of the devil, that is, the people who were there who weren't Methodists, were so enraged because he was brought there that they came upon us and would have taken him away with violence, had we not formed a ring around him 5 or 6 deep in order to keep them off. We first besought God for Christ's sake to restore him to his right mind, which was done. Then he began to pray for himself, and though he did not immediately obtain the faith of assurance, yet he was delivered from despair, and before the meeting broke up, obtained the peace of God to his soul. Glory be to God who heareth prayer. So what does this sound like to you? Does it sound... It's, you know what it sounds like? It sounds like a battle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Captives being retaken, arrows being shot by the divinity down at people, roaring going on. I mean, this is a battle, and the stakes are high, right? The stakes are your eternal soul. Now, what did the Church of England think of this? What did they think of this? John Strachan writing. Now, John Strachan was a Church of England clergyman, originally a Presbyterian. Couldn't get into the Presbyterian church, so decided Church of England would be more for him. And then he became a very, very staunch Church of England clergyman, and eventually the first Bishop of Toronto. He said in 1806, 1 year after this, "The Methodists are making great progress among us and filling the country with the most deplorable fanaticism. You can have almost no conception of their excesses. They will bawl 20 of them at once, tumble on the ground, laugh, sing, jump, and stamp." He hadn't even seen, I mean, that doesn't even scratch the surface. Imagine if he had seen Nathan Bangs' journal. He would have been even more horrified. So, here's the thing. The British were very concerned that in Upper Canada there was going to be a second rebellion, a second revolution. Eventually, of course, there was a rebellion here. But they were very afraid that they were going to lose Upper Canada to the Americans, to republicanism. And so one of the reasons why in 1791 they created the clergy reserves was because they wanted a strong Church of England. Because a strong Church of England would strengthen the imperial connection. Because the church and the state were connected. It's very hard for us to imagine that today. But to be a good member of the Church of England was to be a good subject of the king. Okay? Remember, the king is the head of the church. Okay? So, that very easily transformed into, if you're not a member of the Church of England, you're potentially seditious. Now, where were all these Methodist preachers coming from? The United States. And they were preaching spiritual egalitarianism. And remember too, all these Americans are coming into the province. So the province is very quickly becoming a demographic extension of not Britain, the United States. That's why Isaac Brock was almost sure we were going to lose the War of 1812. Because he thought as soon as the Americans invaded, everyone over here was going to say, all right, come on in. Let's get these British out of here. That didn't happen, as you know. But there was a lot of concern that there was. And so John Strachan and his fellow clergymen started to equate the spread of Methodism with the spread of disloyalty and sedition. Now the War of 1812 happened, the border was closed, and almost all the Methodist preachers had to leave the province. Because they were Americans. They had to get out. There were only a couple that could stay, one of them being Henry Ryan, the stage boxer, because he was born in North America before the outbreak of the First Revolutionary War. So he could say, well, I'm actually British, right? So he stayed here and organized people and kept the classes going. And remember, they had they had a hierarchical church, but they had all these other lay leaders who kind of kept Methodism going through the war. Now, after the war, in 1815, when they started, figuring out how many were left, the church was pretty decimated. About half were lost. Now, it wasn't just that people gave up Methodism. A lot of people gave up living in Upper Canada, went back to the United States after the war. But they realized what they were going to have to do is start raising up a local itinerancy. They needed to get Canadians and people from Britain to come here and be Methodist preachers. So they did that. Now the Methodists never really preached sedition, but this was a really useful tool with which to bludgeon one's opponents. And John Strachan realized that, and so he pushed it and pushed it and pushed it, and so did Bishop Mountain. That was one of the things, of course, in 1793 that the British did. They set up a bishop over here. They'd never done that in the 13 colonies. And that was given as one of the reasons why the revolution happened. If only there had been a bishop there to rein people in. So now there was. And so in 1820, Mountain said the Methodists are the following things. They are self-appointed teachers. They proceed from error to error. They are extravagantly enthusiastic. And they cause mischief through their ignorance and folly. And that was a public denunciation. The Church of England believed that as soon as they could get enough ministers over here, people would just give up that crazy Methodism, and they would all come into the state church. So eventually, after the War of 1812, they started, the Church of England got some grants, and they were able to bring some more clergy over here, but that didn't happen. People didn't give up their Methodism. So the Church of England realized we're going to have to get a little bit more strident. So they took the fight into the public. And so then they started publicly, they had always been denouncing the Methodists to each other in correspondence, but that's not going to do much good. So then they would start preaching sermons against the Methodists when they had an opportunity to do that. And so these are some of the things that they were saying. Now in 1825, Bishop Mountain died, and John Strachan preached his eulogy. And he took the opportunity to deliver a few blows to the Methodists in 1825. He called them, quote, uneducated, remember, itinerant preachers who, leaving their steady employment, in other words, you shouldn't be a minister, go back and be a blacksmith, okay? That's what you should be. They betake themselves to preach the gospel from idleness, well, they weren't idle, but, or a zeal without knowledge, okay, maybe that will stick, by which they are induced without any preparation, i.e. these people did not go to seminary, to teach what they do not know, and from what their pride they disdain to learn. Now that stung one young Methodist preacher to the core. His name was Edgerton Ryerson. Yeah. Probably known. He heard about this, and he was really mad. Really mad, because Edgerton Ryerson, was not a late loyalist. He was a descendant of the UEL family. Right. And Ryerson also had had a good education in the province's grammar schools because he was a descendant from the UELs. Okay? His father was a member, Joseph Ryerson, of the Church of England. Now his father was absolutely horrified when Edgerton Ryerson decided to become a Methodist. And they had a big fight, and Joseph said to Edgerton, you either get back into the Church of England or you're out of my house. And so Ryerson said, get out of your house then. And eventually they patched it up, but this was pretty serious. Now Ryerson had lots of brothers, you probably know. He had older brothers, George, William, and John. He had a younger brother, Edwy. They all became Methodist preachers. Okay, so this was a nightmare for Joseph. Yeah, they all did. They all did. So Edgerton Ryerson, he's a young man. He's appointed to Toronto. There's a little wooden church there, a few Methodists. That's right. Somebody comes in with this, which Strachan had not only preached, but he decided to get printed up. Strachan printed it up, started handing it out, this is what I think. And somehow that fell into the hands of the Methodists. It got read out loud in a room probably not much different than this. And Ryerson was very upset, and he wrote a rebuttal, a public rebuttal, which was published by William Lyon Mackenzie in his newspaper, The Colonial Advocate. Mackenzie hated the Church of England just as much as Ryerson, but for different reasons. Yeah. Mackenzie didn't care as much about religious equality as Ryerson. He was more interested in political equality. But their interests overlapped. And so Ryerson described subsequently in a journal, he said, this unleashed a riot in the province as though there had been a Fenian raid. Everyone was gathered around reading what Ryerson had said. Now, Ryerson published this anonymously. He wasn't that stupid. Because John Strachan by this point was very, very well placed. He was on the Legislative Council. He was on the Executive Council. He had lots of other posts with the Board of Education. He wasn't yet a bishop, but he was a very prominent public figure, and his words carried weight. Ryerson, even though he became very important and eventually helped lay the groundwork for the whole school system in the province, he hadn't done any of that yet. He was nobody. He was just a preacher on trial. He hadn't even been ordained yet by the Methodists. And all he had going for him was his education in the province's grammar school. But he was familiar with a lot of the authorities that Strachan was, and that his fellow Methodists were not. Two of them that he knew very well were Blackstone's commentaries on the law. Methodists didn't know about that stuff because they were from America. They care about that stuff. You know, they were reading the Federalist Papers. Ryerson wasn't reading that stuff. He was reading the stuff that the British read. He also read another guy by the name of William Paley, who was a theorist on church establishment. Paley argued that you can't have an established church unless the majority of people in the area are members of the established church. And so Ryerson was able to use this as an argument. Now, it's actually a fascinating reading, and it's dripping with sarcasm. And when it came out, nobody believed that a Methodist had written it, because there's very few that actually could have written it. Now, one guy really upset was Joseph Ryerson. He was upset. And Edgerton Ryerson went back to visit his dad, and they were talking, and then Joseph started to suspect something that he really didn't want to think about. And so finally he turned to his son and said, "You didn't write that, did you?" And his son went. And Joseph said, "We are ruined. We are ruined." Now, there were people in Upper Canada's past who had challenged John Strachan before, and it did not go well for them. Some of them were horsewhipped, public, not because Strachan said horsewhip this guy. People knew that Strachan they were not happy, and so people wanted to make Strachan happy, so they would do this. You know, Strachan had lots of disciples, and he ran a school in Cornwall, and a lot of the people who went to his school eventually became very important in the government. John Beverly Robinson, among them. Yeah, and so Joseph Ryerson was very, very worried. There were laws. There were sedition laws, there were libel laws. Strachan knew about all of these, he could use them effectively. But at this particular point, things were starting to change. And so Ryerson actually set off a spark that started to change the province. And with the help of Mackenzie, and later Ryerson started he didn't start the paper, the Methodists started the paper, but he became the founding editor of a newspaper called the Christian Guardian, which was started in 1829. And by about 1832, it was the most widely read newspaper in the colony. And he was the editor, and he used that as a platform to fight against the privileges of the Church of England and establishment. And things get very complicated after this, so I don't want to go into that. But I just wanted to, with this talk, give you a sense of these two factions, one formalist, one established, one with the powers of the government behind it, and this other sort of rabble-rousing group, the Methodists, coming over the border, running these wild camp meetings, and then Ryerson getting involved, but different than the other Methodists because of his upbringing and background. And that put him in a position to sort of bridge the gap between the two worlds. He could fight Strachan on Strachan's own ground. You know, he knew all the texts Strachan knew. He knew the laws. He was an able opponent for Strachan in a way that no other Methodist preacher would have been, except for maybe some of Ryerson's brothers, but they probably lacked the intestinal fortitude to do what Ryerson did, because it was dangerous. And Edgerton Ryerson was very, very clever about the way he went about it in the public sphere, you know, with the press, very much in the open, trying to persuade people that his position was the right one, and not using the force of law and the force of government and those types of privileges to win the day, which is what Strachan tried to do. It didn't work. didn't work for him. And eventually, Ryerson and Strawn did sort of patch it up, and they did get to the point where they could tolerate one another's company, and they even shared a carriage ride together at one point, where Strawn was giving Ryerson advice on how he could get money from the government for his educational establishment. Ryerson became the first president of Victoria College after it went from being Upper Canada College to Upper Canada Academy into Victoria College in around 1840. So questions, comments? I know I've rambled on much too long. I apologize for that. Yes?
I'm going to ask the same thing as David. You talk about these fellows going out into small areas
Yeah.
and selling books.
Yeah.
Well, most of the people couldn't read. So
Well, that's not actually true. And you know, that's a very interesting question though, and a very interesting point. The whole issue of literacy. There are no good surveys of literacy in the colony around that time. But what we do know is that where most of the UELs came from, literacy rates were extremely high. In New England, before the Revolutionary War, literacy rates were almost 100%, which is hard to believe. But they had a good school system there. The literacy rate in the province was, I think, a lot higher than a lot of historians have concluded. And the reason for that is because people who came over here, like Anne Jameson, are you guys familiar with her? What is it, her book, Summer Rambles, Winter, you know this one, Dave.
Winter Study, Summer Rambles.
Right. She talks about literacy in the province, and she says, oh, nobody can read here, 1 in 40. She hated being here. Everything here was no good, right? She didn't like the newspaper, she didn't like the culture. And now a lot of historians, because there is no good survey of literacy rates, a lot of historians have relied on this type of anecdotal evidence to conclude that literacy rates were very low. But when you actually look at where people were coming from and what literacy rates were in the United States, they were much higher. They couldn't have been that low. Now, other historians, more recent social historians, one woman in particular by the name of Carol Wilton, she did a study of people signing their names. And she did this in the very early part of the 1830s. And about 85% of people in the 1830s could sign their name. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they could write, it just means they could sign their name. It also doesn't necessarily mean they could read, it just means they could sign their name. But it does suggest that they might have been able to read. At least, higher than what Anna Jameson said. Now, the thing is, too, when Anna Jameson said that, there was a thriving periodical press in the colony already by then. People were reading the Christian Guardian, they were reading the Colonial Advocate, they were reading the Gazette. If nobody could read, these newspapers would never have survived because these newspapers were not receiving government grants. They survived through subscription. Nobody's going to buy what they can't read. So, I think literacy, sorry for such a long answer, but I think literacy rates were higher than is generally believed. Yeah?
I'm curious where the Catholic Church was at that time, because I know there's a church near here that was established in 1850. They'd begun to move this far north that early.
Yeah.
So they had to have been in Toronto before that, and some coming from Quebec as well. Where did they play in this whole
Well,
thing, if at all?
I don't know as much about the Catholic Church, but I do know that their position in Lower Canada was very different than it was here in Upper Canada. They were essentially accorded establishment status in Lower Canada, but not in Upper Canada. So it was a harder battle for them up here. Now there is a recent biography of the first Catholic bishop, Michael Power is his name. Yeah, and that was done by the president of St. Mike's, whose name I forget. I've actually been on a committee with him and I forget his name now. But that would be a good place to find out more. But it's outside my immediate area of expertise, so I'm not going to hazard a
There just
guess.
must have been some at that time because of how early they were this far
Yeah,
out of the city.
yeah. Yeah.
The Bank of Upper Canada in Toronto, which was founded in 1825, the property that it was founded on had been a Roman Catholic church. It had been down in the basement.
Oh.
So they were there in the 1820s. And as a matter of fact, they were there even in 1812 because they were actually in this underground basement, which is part of the old Bank of Upper Canada building. There are bullet holes in the walls that date back to 1812. So, yeah, they were there. The Catholics were there.
Yes.
In Flannel, there's a primitive Methodist
Uh-huh.
church. And then there's a Methodist Episcopal. And I don't know, I'm getting confused about how many different churches there are.
There are many. Yeah, Methodism experienced lots of schisms. Henry Ryan, who I refer to, he was responsible for one in the 1820s. He broke off and formed his own church, which eventually merged with the Protestant Episcopal Methodist Church. There were so many of them. You see, the Methodists, okay, the main branches were in the States. You had the Methodist Episcopal Church, established in 1784, spreads to Upper Canada. And then after the War of 1812, the British Wesleyans, who were also Methodists, they started coming over to the province. So you had the Episcopal Methodists against the British Wesleyans. And they came to an agreement in 1820. Episcopal Methodists take Upper Canada, British Wesleyans can have Lower Canada. That was the deal they arrived at. And so then the Methodist Episcopal Church remained part of the United States till 1828, became independent then. But not everybody was happy with that. So they became the Canadian Methodist Church, and they stayed like that till 1833. Then they merged with the British Wesleyans who were coming back over the border, Upper Canada, and they became the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Canada. But that church, there were lots of people who weren't happy about that, so they broke off and became the Canada Methodist Episcopal Church. Okay? But then the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Canada, in 1840, they merged in 1833 and 1840, they broke apart again. So from 1840 to 1847, you had the British Wesleyans, you had the Canadian Wesleyan Methodists, and then you had the Episcopal Methodists. You also had the Ryanites schismatics, plus you had schisms in the U.S., the first one happened there in the 18th century. They started coming up. Then you had the Primitive Methodists. That was a schism in Britain. They started coming over. So the Methodist Church, there's a chart that they had down at the United Church Archives. You know, the Methodist Church became the United Church in Canada. They've got a chart that shows all the branches. And I think anytime you have a religion that is like this, they call it a boiling hot religion. That's how they describe it. When you have a religion like that and people are really passionate about, you get this type of thing, schisms happening all the time. Yeah. So I don't know whether that answers your question, except to say that it is very complicated, sorting out one Methodist from another. Yes.
It becomes interesting now when you travel. You quite often see cemeteries that were, called a Wesleyan or a Methodist cemetery.
Yeah.
I wonder if it would have been typical for some of those cemeteries to exist where it wasn't even a churchyard there, that it was just
Well,
because a lot of the buildings are gone, like a lot of old churches have disappeared in Ontario.
Yeah.
And the cemetery remains, and you'll just see a little plaque that it's.
Yeah. Now that's an interesting question. Now I maybe have given
didn't have a church.
Well, I may have given a slightly wrong impression when I was talking about sort of that early expansion of Methodism in the early time. With the circuit riders and no churches, they preach in barns and fields and log cabins and so on. Remember Ryerson carried the whole thing into the public. He wanted to make Methodism more respectable. The same type of thing was happening down in the States. And so the Methodists, one of the first things they did was these type of wild camp meetings, that really started to trail off.
Right.
And women preaching in public, that started to trail off too, because that wasn't respectable. And then the Methodists wanted churches, and they wanted manses or rectories. And so slowly they started to become they started to look a lot like the Church of England in some ways. And in fact, the Methodists were called the unofficial established church in Canada by about the 1860s. They were more numerous than anybody else, and they had more financial resources than anybody else. They had massive Sunday schools. I mean, it's extraordinary what they built themselves into. And the United Church today is just this shell of what Methodism used to be in the 19th century. But eventually, yeah, they did build churches. But that was later coming. They didn't need that when they were spreading initially. Whereas these other formalist churches, they wanted that from the get-go. They didn't want to just be... Now, it's kind of interesting, too, because David Chambers lent me a book called Lions in the Way, and describes Featherstone Osler sort of traveling around here a little bit. And, you know, it's really interesting reading that, because his experience is not that different from some of these Methodists. He traveled around, too. And, you know, he had horrible situations like, you know, sleeping in people's houses and being devoured by bed bugs all night and things like that. And the Methodists used to complain about stuff like that. That's because by around that time in the 1830s, the Church of England realized if we're going to compete, we got to get out there.
Yeah.
And they started to change their tactics a little bit. So one of the things Featherstone Osler did was he stopped preaching from a page. He said, I want to do it like that, but nobody will listen to me. And there's a cow in the corner of the room too, bleeding, and if I'm reading from a page, I just can't get through to anybody. Also, people would bring barking dogs with them to church. That was a tactic for undermining ministers. They would bring barking dogs, and so Featherstone Osler knew he was making headway when people stopped bringing their dogs with them to church. The Methodists had that same problem too. One early preacher actually it was William Case. He went into a small community, and a guy came out before he started preaching, and he had a noose with him. And William Case said, "What's that for?" And he said, "It's for you if I don't like your sermon." Yeah, it was dangerous. Yeah.
When did the Wesleyan Methodists start baptizing children? Because I've used their baptismal registers to research a lot of my family.
Yeah.
When did that officially start?
Well, officially that would have started in 1784 in the U.S. because
Here,
remember.
not Canada.
Well, it would have just spread up here. Okay. Now, the real point of contention around the sacraments in Upper Canada was well, I guess the sacraments more in the Catholic sense, but the big issue up here was the legal authority to marry people. That was the big problem. Baptisms weren't as big a deal because it wasn't something that the state authorized in the same way that they authorized marriage. And Wesley, being a Church of England clergyman, he never had a problem with infant baptism. Yeah, so that was always part of. So, and that was actually the Methodists. Now this is hard to believe too, but the Methodists, one of their competitors were the Baptists, right? The Baptists were a lot like the Methodists, except the Baptists don't believe in infant baptism. And so sometimes you would read about there would be a Methodist preacher come into the village and a Baptist preacher come into the village, and they would have a public debate about infant baptism, and hundreds of people would come to listen to this. This was really exciting and important, right? And people were really interested. Now, if you had that today, I don't think that many people would come. But back then, these were vital questions people were really concerned about. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes?
You were referring to the fact that during the 1780s, it was like women slaves who were allowed.
They were, yeah.
Approval. I mean, was that maintained in terms of actually perhaps thinking of the ratios of that it began and therefore did it continue?
No, it didn't. And it's interesting, as Methodism became more respectable, the role of women, and certainly enslaved peoples too, became, at least before the Civil War in the U.S., became much, much less prominent. Now the Methodist Church in the States, speaking of schisms, they split in 1844 over the issue of slavery into the Methodist Episcopal Church North and the Methodist Episcopal Church South, because a bishop in the South owned a slave, and they weren't going to allow that. And so the whole church split well before the Civil War over that issue. One of the other interesting things about this role of women, and if you visit this website and take a look at this journal, remember this thing I was reading about the daughters of Jerusalem and the daughters of pride? And so this young woman, right, an upper class woman, she goes to the camp meeting and she gets converted. Her sister's horrified though, right? Like, oh my God, look at these people are insane and you're joining them? Are you kidding me? So she's trying to drag her sister away, and Bangs' journal, the thing he actually wrote at the time, says that a bunch of Methodist women, who he calls the daughters of Jerusalem, went off and physically grabbed this woman and dragged her back to the camp meeting. Now, it's a really interesting discrepancy, because after this, Bangs wrote an autobiography when he was an old man, in the 1860s. They got the whole thing down in New Jersey, and I was looking at it. It's extremely hard to read. His handwriting is just awful. But I was able to make out that in that version of these events, which he recounts, it's not a bunch of women this time. It's some man. It's some man. He says, oh, some man went off and grabbed this woman and dragged her back, right? It's a very strange thing, right? They sort of rewriting history, saying, no, it wasn't women who did that. It was this man. And then that autobiography was published after Bangs' death. And in the published version, it says that Bangs was the one who went off and brought that woman back, right? So it kept changing. It started off where women were the heroes, and then it was some guy not identified, and then that became him. Yeah. So you can see how not only did women have a smaller and smaller public role to play, but history was actually being rewritten, and they were being written right out of it. Yeah.
I've just got one more point, and that is, I always like, where expressions come from, and whether or not people are familiar with it, because I need to just bang on about something. Whether that came
From Nathan Bangs?
Yeah.
No, an unusual name. Wesley, probably the saying he's most famous for is, cleanliness is next to godliness.
Yeah, exactly.
That's John Wesley who
Yeah.
said that. But no, Bangs didn't say that. Some of the names of these preachers is, they're kind of interesting. Bangs is the most prominent Methodist preacher in Upper Canada for the first decade of the 19th century. But for the decade before, in the 1790s, there was a young preacher, and his name was Hezekiah Calvin Wooster. And I love that, right? It's like Bertie Wooster, right? Hezekiah Calvin Wooster, and he was this guy. Actually, it's interesting because he was preaching on one occasion, and he was being heckled. Now, one of the things the Methodists like to do in their journals, and they would tell these anecdotes, people who heckled them, they would end badly. They would die, or they would get sick, right? And so, at one of these gatherings, there was a man who was heckling Hezekiah Calvin Wooster, and he pointed at him. I won't point at anybody here because I don't want to make anyone nervous. And he said, "God, smite him." And the guy dropped dead on the spot. So pretty extraordinary. Now, lots of Methodists afterwards tried that. But it didn't work that one time for Hezekiah Calvin Wooster. So, yeah, he unfortunately, well, depending on your perspective, Hezekiah died of consumption before reaching his 30th birthday. So it was a hard life, and you couldn't maintain it for long. So eventually, what a preacher would do is he'd get married, and then he would settle. He'd become a local preacher, which meant you were no longer on payroll, but you get paid much anyway, so it didn't matter. And then you would, you'd start your family and so on, and you'd be this local resource, and then they'd replace you with some other young guy who could put up with these massive physical demands, traveling around, preaching every day, sleeping in different people's houses, not having, and some of the conditions they had to sleep in were horrendous, bed bugs and rats and mice and,